Okay, I think we're here live. Good evening, everybody who is now watching us. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys. This time we're going to share together with an interview. My name is Lucas, and I'm going to present to you guys now what this live is about. So this is the literary talk, which is an extension project from the Federal University of Mato Grosso do Sul, Universidade Federal do Mato Grosso do Sul, a project created and structured by the professor Elton Furlaneto, who is the professor responsible for the English language and literature at the Letras course from the University of Mato Grosso do Sul. The Literary Talk is a project where we can, as the name says, talk to authors, translators, and people involved with the literary field. And here with me as interviewers is Ana and Kael. And I'm gonna let Kael introduce our guest right now, and then we start with the questions. You guys can comment on the chat. You guys know better than I how this technology works. So please be with us, like the video, and let's start.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. So today we have the privilege of speaking with Naseem Jamnia, a talented and versatile writer whose work spans speculative fiction, nonfiction, editing, and so much more. Naseem's debut novella, The Bruising of Qilwa, has earned critical acclaim as a finalist for multiple prestigious awards. And their highly anticipated middle grade horror novel, Sleepaway, is set to release next winter. With a background in neuroscience, creative writing, and gender studies, Naseem brings a rich interdisciplinary perspective to their stories, which often explores themes like identity, justice, and belonging. Beyond writing, they are deeply engaged in uplifting marginalized voices through initiatives like the Heretics Workshop and Author Against Book Bans, as well as their editorial work at Sword Kettle Press. Naseem, thank you so much for joining us today, and let's dive into your fascinating journey as a writer, advocate, and in my view, a queer icon.
Thank you so much. I think that's the nicest introduction anyone has ever given me. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And thank you. I aspire to be a queer icon, so, I try.
And you are. So I have the first question for you, okay? So could you share what drew you to speculative fiction, particularly fantasy and horror, and how your cultural background influenced your storytelling?
Absolutely. That's such a great question. Fantasy has been my first love forever. I've been a voracious reader since I was a child. I lived in public libraries, volunteered in public libraries, and I was always drawn to fantasy. And I think that came from my father, who is a big fan of speculative fiction. He would always, he has read Lord of the Rings more times than I can count. He loves Dune, which I think is very interesting as a Muslim man to love Dune as much as he does. And he's read multiple of the sequels and all of that. And so when I started being at the library all the time, I would pick up fantasy books and I would love it. And I had a lot of fun. Of course, I grew up with Harry Potter. I try not to harp on that, though, because of the author. But the series that particularly shaped me when I was a child was Tamara Pierce's Song of the Lioness. She wrote this in like the late 70s, early 80s, if I remember. And it featured a girl who wanted to be a knight in a realm that only had boy knights. And so she disguises herself as her twin brother, goes to become a knight, is exposed as a woman, and still has her adventures. I resonated with that depiction very much because my father was at that time a martial artist, and I was fascinated by that avenue, kind of what knighthood was. There's certainly kind of a cultural element to that as well, with how we think of chivalry in the West comes from my part of the world, the West Asia, the Middle East. The particularly resonated with me because I didn't have words to describe my gender at that point. And that was the closest thing, same with Disney's Mulan. That was one of my favorite movies, got that kind of stuff. So from a young age, I was engaging in fantasy because it gave me a space that didn't look like the world around me, and a world that I felt very othered from a young age. I grew up in a family of immigrants. I have a severely disabled brother. We were bilingual. We were growing up in a major metropolitan area in Chicago, but we lived in a religious center. So I from a very young age, I was looking for these kind of escape parts, and fantasy made anything seem possible. I loved it so much. And I started writing my own fantasy stuff at a young age as a result, because I was trying to emulate these worlds that I had found so much solace in. Horror came much later, actually. I did not engage with horror at all as a child. Goosebumps, the cover of Goosebumps books scared the crap out of me. I was like, nope, I'm not. Horror is not me. I could not watch horror movies. I watched the Blair Witch Project as a teen, and I couldn't go into the woods for months. And my family, that was what we would do. We would go hiking because it's cheap. It's free to go hiking. So it was, I was not a horror person at all. And so it's so funny to me that now I'm writing horror, because I only started engaging with horror in my 20s. My parents are big fans of Stephen King, and my dad read Stephen King's fantasy series, The Dark Tower, when I was growing up. And he said, you can't read this until you're an adult. It's not appropriate. And so when I finally read them as an adult, so I could engage with him. But then as a result, I started with Stephen King, as many people who go into horror do, and then became more interested in more inclusive forms of horror. And my spouse is a big horror buff. My best friends are big horror buffs. And so I started watching more horror movies. I still watch them between my fingers because I'm a baby. But I was amazed by how much horror can be used as a lens to look at the world, and how interesting the stories are when marginalized writers approach horror from that lens, and the ways in which our everyday experiences are horrors. And how there can be so much catharsis in what horror can offer us, and so much commentary and reflection, and kind of leaning into yes, a lot of this stuff is really terrible. So, so again, I find it really funny that now I write as much horror as I do, but truly, we are in a golden age of speculative fiction, kind of across the board. I'm deeply impressed by everything that I've been reading, and I'm incredibly amazed to be amongst such giants that are in the field right now. I don't know if that actually answered your question, but I thought about fantasy. I thought about horror.
Yes, Kyle? No? Okay. Yes, I'm going to continue with the next question, but I think so much food for thought for us in this part of how horror can be a lens to, I'm just thinking about everything. And you said about your new writing, when I saw what it was about the plot, and you just mentioned Goosebumps, I can't help myself by thinking of Nightmare Camp or something like this from Goosebumps series. There is a book about a camp, and I think campings are kind of scary. But I would like you also to comment a little bit on your relation, the relation you see of yourself with fiction and nonfiction. Because, we read your biography, and the path you made through academic studies, and also the articles you write, and the fiction you wrote and is writing right now, how do they merge or not merge? And I want to know if you considered that during all this academic path that you all also walked through, fiction was there, even though you were writing nonfiction. What is the relation between fiction and nonfiction in your history?
Yeah, that's great. I have not thought about this, but you're right that fiction has always been there. Absolutely. Since childhood, writing my own fantasy stuff. Then in high school, I wrote a lot of fan fiction. And college, I had to rediscover creative writing and kind of writing my own original stuff. But I think that anyone who believes that fiction, even fantasy, or even any sort of something that doesn't even seem like it's remotely related to our world, anyone who believes that that's not influenced by our world, you're kidding yourself. It necessarily is, because we are individuals in this world. And as writers, regardless of how intentionally we do it or not, we are constantly importing our worldviews into the works that we write. I don't think I could pick up. I really believe you could pick up any book, regardless of genre, regardless if it's fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and the way in which the author has how they view the world will come through in those pages. And some places it's obviously more easy to see that than in others, but it's necessarily there because that's how we approach everything, right? And how we think about stories and storytelling also necessarily is impacted by how we've, not just the stories that we've, that we've engaged with, but also the stories that are told around us constantly. The kinds of there are so many assumptions that are imported into writing, fiction being a really great example of this, fantasy being an even better example of this, that if we don't interrogate, we will import them into our writing. Just kind of, like a classic example I tend to use is like, many fantasies are based in kind of this imaginary of medieval Europe, and I use imaginary very deliberately here because it's imagined, kind of reconstructed what medieval Europe was, and particularly in the United States, how we think about it, and yet people of color are not. There's no kind of people of color in there, or they're in very very kind of specific roles, or there aren't any queer people. Because homophobia must be everywhere, and therefore queer people can't exist, or they must always be persecuted. And I think that's very silly because I'm not a historian, but there's so much evidence that our understanding today of modern gender and sexuality is not what has been around for the ages, thanks colonial Christianity. But that's a little off topic. But for me personally, I knew I loved the sciences from a young age. I knew I wanted to be in the sciences. My brother has classical autism. I was always really fascinated by why our brains are different. Turns out our brains are not so different. I have ADHD and OCD. So go figure. But I was always really fascinated by that. And so my parents, being the immigrant parents that they were, said, do your art on the side, go into the sciences, because the sciences is a secure career path. Of course, we could always argue, is academia really that secure? That's debatable, but that's what I was doing. And so the kind of nonfiction stuff was, for a while, it was more bench science focused before it kind of transitioned into more personal essays a little later on. I have always been kind of involved in mental health research in some way, working with my mom, who is a professor of, actually now she's a dean. I'm very proud of her. My mom is such a rock star, but she was a professor of early childhood education and focusing a lot on childhood mental health. So, a lot of my nonfiction stuff was about that, but in my fiction, I was also thinking about stuff like mental health and stuff like, what is autonomy to a child, especially in a world that doesn't view children as autonomous. So, it was always there. In college, when I started coming back to fiction, I wrote a novel that I was so sure was going to be like the great American novel. I think a lot of writers, especially in the US, have this like grandiose idea of, we're going to create this book. And it was about mental health. It was about mental illness. And it was about how a child navigates those things as they get older, depending on the environment that they're in, following a specific group of characters. So it was always going to be there. And now I do a lot more fiction than I do nonfiction, but they're at least for me, they're always in conversation with each other, because anything I'm thinking about in my personal life, I either write it into my newsletter, which I do personal essays every month in my newsletter, personal essay kind of being a loose term there, or manifest in my fiction, where I'm kind of interrogating it or leaning into it, depending on what the thing is. So I definitely think that we have to be cognizant of how our real world and our lives impact the things that our art. I'll actually just do art more generally, because it's not just writing. Because otherwise, like I said earlier, we could really import some stuff that we just don't interrogate and perpetuate it some more.
All right. Nice to meet you, Naseem. Since you spoke about your horror experience, your experience growing up with horror literature and etc., I want to ask you about your YA horror anthology. So it's called The White Guy Dies First, and your short story is about a trans character who goes through a body horror experience. So I want to know, where did the idea to relate transness and body horror come from?
I think there's a lot of trans people who are turning to body horror as a way to express ideas of what does it mean to be in a body. And I don't mean the narrative of like you were born in the wrong body. For some people it does feel like that. For some people they, but I think a lot of people experience body dysmorphia in some form, right? There's certainly, I imagine this is kind of a worldwide phenomenon, but certainly the United States, the kind of messaging about what beauty looks like, what bodies should or should not look like is very strong. It's very, very pervasive. And every culture has their kind of own understanding of what beauty is, right? That necessarily means what a body should be or should not be. And there's billions of dollars that are poured into industry, like the weight loss industry in the United States, for example, right? To kind of perpetuate this because money talks. So I think a lot of trans people, we see body horror as a way to explore feelings of what does it mean to be in a body, regardless of how you feel about that body. I wish I remembered what the anthology name is. It's on my shelf. I picked up a collective. Oh gosh, I'm gonna have to go check that at some point to get that anthology name. But there is an anthology of trans body horror that I picked up at some point that I was interested in. I had read a short story by a friend of mine, August Clark, where they explored, they did a body horror with a character whose gender I think is never explicitly stated. And I was really touched because the body horror in that one was used as a way of otherness, but also as a way of connection, because the narrator, the person narrating it, was experiencing a body horror situation that their neighbor had also is like very openly, they were growing arms out of their back. That was the kind of body horror happening. And there was a member in their community who very openly had these arms out of their back and they were ostracized. And so as the main character was growing these arms, they loved them. They were embracing that. It wasn't a horror. It was a catharsis. It was a sense of this is what feels like me. And connected with this neighbor as a result of that. And I was very moved by this story. And that's kind of what started me thinking about, what happens when your body does things that you don't expect, want, anticipate, because bodies do that all the time. Across the board, as we grow up, puberty, when you step back and think about it, puberty is kind of horrifying, but so any stage of development comes with different bodily changes. Like I'm in my 30s, my body is doing stuff that I'm like, what? I'm not 18 anymore. What do you mean? Like I have to take rest and like, why are you doing this, body? And so that's the universal experience. And then to think about it from a trans lens, when so many people feel like their bodies, a lot of trans people will call their bodies meat cages or something similar. It's being kind of constraining what we could potentially be. So I really love that. I love reading body horror from trans people. I think it helps that I can't physically picture things because I can't watch body horror. Watching body horror really freaks me out, but I love writing it and I love reading it. The AJ White, who wrote, who has been writing a lot of trans body horror in the YA scene, is a really great example of someone who's thinking about a lot of that stuff. His debut, Hell Followed With Us, is it's like body horror from the opening pages, and it's done. The main character is literally becoming, a Revelations-esque monster, and is dealing with the kind of religious trauma that they have in their past, and their body horror is reflecting kind of this journey of dealing with this religious trauma. And I think that's such a great example of body horror and horror in general being more than just what it is. So I knew, when Terry J. Benton Walker, the editor for the anthology, he's one of my closest friends, when we were talking about this anthology, and he was just like, so what are you going to reinvent? Because that's the whole anthology is 13 authors of color looking at classic horror tropes or genres and reinventing them. I was like, oh, body horror. Like this is that was already going to be the thing. I was like, I'm going to claim this from the get-go. And I knew right away that I wanted to create a story in which the character felt liberated by the changes undergoing their body as opposed to horrified.
I like that because horror is one of the most subversive genres you can think about. So usually when we talk about queer representativity, and gender in general, we think about horror because it's more subversive and think people are like freer to do things with it, opposite to other kinds of genres. So
absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of people see, I mean, so many people have seen historically and still do see queerness as a horror, you know, as monstrosity. Queer monstrosity is definitely, you know, from what I understand, is definitely like a burgeoning kind of field of examining things. But I think a lot of people queer people are drawn to monsters and the monstrous because that's how we've been labeled, because that's the kind of box that a lot of people have been put in. And I think body horror is something very similar for trans people.
So, and I'm interested about what made you decide to write middle grade, because you have written adult fiction. So, what made you decide that to write a middle grade book for the first time?
So actually, the book that I signed with my agent was a middle grade. So when I left I shouldn't say I left academia because I went back for a creative writing master's. But when I left neuroscience, you know, I decided I was going to sit down and figure out, like, okay, if I want to be traditionally published, what do I need to do to be traditionally published? Because I didn't know literary agents were a thing until my final year in college. That's a thing that once you start going down the, like, how do I get published path, they pop up. But until then, you have no idea, like, what the kind of process is. It's incredibly opaque, even to people within the industry. But, you know, literary agent represents your work to editors, because editors at the big publishing houses in the United States, they would otherwise be so inundated with submissions that they need a gatekeeper. So, you know, we can, there's all sorts of commentaries on the gatekeepers in publishing, right? But when I decided that I was going to go down, I wanted to try traditional publishing. I turned to, you know, it was an interesting place because I'd left neuroscience, which is something I had been thinking about doing for a while, but then I did it. I was recently married. And at the time that I had started my PhD program, my husband was in Reno, Nevada, which is where I am now, doing his own graduate program. And so I moved out here, and, you know, like, Reno is a city, but it's a strange city. I wish I could describe why it's strange, but it has a lot of small town sort of feels, despite being a city. But I didn't know anybody here. I felt incredibly isolated. My depression was really bad. You know, I kept going back and forth of, like, did I just screw up my whole life by leaving the thing that I was preparing to do for so long, something I knew that I would excel in. So it was at that point where, you know, at some point, like, deep in the depression haze, I was like, well, what I want to be doing is writing fiction. So if I want to write fiction, maybe I should actually write fiction. And at that point, you know, I started reading kind of like young adult. I started reading middle grade, and I started reading adult stuff. And I also started re-engaging with cultural ties that I had felt frayed for many years. And I had mentioned earlier that I grew up in a religious center. I grew up in a Sufi center. Sufism is the mystical branch of Islam. It's what it's commonly known as. And, you know, poets like Rumi, Hafez, Saadi, these are Iranian, well, not just Iranian, I should say Persian poets, who were Sufi mystics. And so because I grew up in a Sufi house, I was inundated with Persian cultural artifacts from birth. And I'm very lucky that I was, because a lot of diaspora kids don't have this opportunity. But I was, and once I went to college, I no longer was waking up every morning to that. And I felt very isolated. And my parents moved out of the center, and the center moved locations, you know, kind of just like life happens. So by that point, this was my mid-20s. I was in Nevada, didn't know anybody. And I was very lonely. So I started turning to the things that sparked my love of stories to begin with, which was the fantasy stuff. But beyond that was my father telling me stories from the Persian Epic of Kings, the Shahnameh. So, you know, I was just like, okay, well, what if I told a Shahnameh story? My favorite story was always about Zal and the Simurgh. And this is a story of a boy who's born with albinism to a regional king. And the king and you know, the regional king and queen are like, oh no, our child is a demon. Let's chuck him into the mountains. And then he's found by the Persian equivalent of a phoenix, you know, a kind of mystical healing bird. And at first she takes him to feed him to her babies. And then she's like, all right, I'll raise you. And then, you know, many years later, people from his father's court find him in the mountains, and they're like, oh, you're still alive. I guess we should bring you back in. I always loved that story. I always loved Zal, who is lesser known than his very famous son, Rostam, who is kind of like the Persian Hercules. So I started writing a story about that. I started thinking, how would I tell this story? And what do I want to bring to the story? What is different for why am I approaching the story to begin with? And I started telling the story of a girl whose village was decimated by a plague. This was well before COVID. It was the first time I did National Novel Writing Month, and I completed it because I wasn't employed. I was doing freelancing pieces, so I could sit down and I could do it. And I was like, okay, let's do this thing. So I was very lucky because my previous agent query, trying to send out my book stuff didn't bite. The Great American Novel I tried to write, like I didn't get bites on that. But this was at a time when a lot of middle grade retellings were selling. So I had many agents who were interested in multiple agents offers, and I was very lucky. Of course, the ironic thing being that we still haven't sold this book. Now I'm aging it up to young adults, but my love of middle grade began there. Especially because, middle grade and young adult as we know it now didn't exist as publishing categories until the mid 2010s, really with Twilight, Hunger Games. Hunger Games particularly really created YA as a category. But middle grade is kind of often the lesser known because it's just a little younger. The concerns are a little different. The way you approach things are a little different. And yet that age, the 8 to 12 year age, is such a fraught time to be a child. When you're a teenager, you're kind of coming up against the knowledge and realization that you are becoming an adult, and you're not yet there. You're not given the autonomy that adults are given, but you're still a child when you're doing middle grade stuff, and you're trying to figure out who am I and where do I belong within my community, within my family structure. What makes me me. And I love that. I love that about middle grade. So I wrote this book because I was just like, what would the 10-year-old me have needed to read about? And I wrote it, and I love this story. I really hope one day it will get picked up. But that's what started my kind of love of middle grade. And then, a few years later, we got plenty of bites. We haven't sold the story yet. And I heard about a work for hire project. And this is when someone comes up with, a story idea, does some sort of details, and then they hire a writer to do it. And so, my agent was like, would you be interested in trying this kind of work? And I was like, yeah, sure, let's try it. And I auditioned with pages of the story that was then Sleepaway. It's now called The Glade. That was a relatively recent name change. And I was lucky enough to be hired for the project. And so, it was very fun to try to figure out, how do I write this story? Because the one I had worked on before was in third person, which gives you enough distance that you don't have to be in the child's head. Because I remember the feelings of being 11. I don't remember the voice of being 11. And so I wrote the original story for The Glade in third person. And when our first round of submission didn't sell, the packager came back and was like, what do you think about changing this to first person? And that was an experience, but I'm really glad I did, because then we sold the book. So that was a very roundabout way of saying how I got into middle grade. There you have it. I warned you that I could talk for 4 hours. So
it's perfect. Well, I will leave this talk with so much to think about, because Anna's question was great, because I'm thinking now about the book market in Brazil, the translations we are getting. And yes, I go to the bookstore, I look at the books there, and there's a lot of labeled queer or LGBT plus books with this theme of horror, or I think about some titles about this, like Two Boys in the Woods, or there's an assassin in the neighborhood, or something like this. And it's about gay protagonists or queer protagonists in general. Well, my question goes in a sequence as with Kyle's question, because I was really interested in asking you about the exactly what you mentioned in the end of your last answer, which was the difference between writing for not specifically for adults, but writing a book, and on the other hand, writing specifically for a younger public. So my question is, like, how was that specifically to find this voice? How do you see is or is not different talking to kids or youngers or teenagers rather than adults? But also if in some way writing for you, because it's very nice this discipline you have of writing every month, the newsletter, and kind of I could kind of grasp that you force yourself of writing, of keeping this routine. If this is for you or if it's not, not a healing thing, but kind of just the word heal comes to my mind, but like a treatment, a process. How does literature get into you, especially having to look to yourself younger? How is this encounter? How is this encounter that only fiction makes possible? I want to hear a little bit about it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to caveat by saying that writing is very cathartic, I think, for a lot of people, kind of regardless of what you're doing. Any art is, right? You're necessarily tapping into something, creative force inside of you that I think everybody has. But writing as therapy is something separate. And it's, I've seen a lot of people who are I've read a lot of things that people are processing through writing. They're not necessarily things that should be public facing, or they're not necessarily things that maybe one day they might be public facing in some form, but they might not be ready yet. And certainly I have published things, especially when I was starting out with personal essays. And there's a whole separate conversation about what the personal essay market was looking like in the mid 2010s. It was kind of exploitative, a lot exploitative. Some stuff that now I'm just like, well, I don't know that I would say I'd regret publishing them, but like, it wouldn't have been bad if I had like paused for a little bit. So there is that difference there. But I do like that you use the word healing, because I think about all of the books I was reading as a child and never seeing myself in them. I mentioned Alana. I mentioned Mulan's not being a book, but a piece of media. And I saw a bit of my gender reflected there, but I didn't see me reflected there because we're intersectional individuals, right? Like kind of our identities are not so simple as kind of a single thing. And I didn't see myself really in a book until I read Persepolis in college. I was 21. And the thing that made me see myself was in the beginning of Persepolis, which is a graphic memoir. It's not a graphic novel, it's a graphic memoir. There is two things that happen. One thing that happens is, the narrator, Marjane, is she goes to bed and she has a conversation with God. And that's exactly how I always imagined speaking to God when I was a child. I was like stunned that I was like, oh, that could be me. And the other thing was that it mentioned the Fire at Cinema Rex, which kickstarted the Iranian Revolution in the 70s. And I have a personal tie to that because my grandfather was the police chief of Abadan, which is where Cinema Rex happened. He was on the ground that night. And that was something I didn't know, until around that time. He actually did an interview around that time about it. And I was like, oh, I love this man. And suddenly like he's connected with this really horrific massacre. Because for a while they thought the police did it. And there's a whole conversation about him being a police in the first place and how I feel about police, but that's separate. So for me, a lot of writing, I always am thinking about what is it that I want to read? Because if I'm not interested in reading it, why am I writing it? And also because that means that it's probably not there because I didn't see that for a long time. And if I didn't see it, well, there's going to be other people who didn't see it either, and they might be interested. But particularly when I'm thinking about writing for a younger audience, I'm really thinking about that 10-year-old who was in the library all the time, whose best friends were in books, who was incredibly lonely, and was still trying to figure out who they were in a world that was telling them who they thought they should be. And I think that is really healing. The Glade is, I didn't, it's interesting because, I didn't come up with the concept for the Glade. To some degrees, the characters were given to me, to some degrees, the plot beats were given to me. But as I worked on it, it really became my own story. The characters were all coded, except with the exception of one character, they were all like white coded. And immediately I was like, we're not doing this. The main character's best friend, like in the notes that I had gotten, was like, she presents as a tomboy, but she's definitely a straight girl. And I was like, we're not doing this, and then as the story went on, I approached the horror in a completely different way than what kind of the original creators of the idea had been thinking. And I really think that despite it being horror and me being a little scaredy cat child of horror, I think that it would have been healing to see that book, because even though it's not about these things, I talk about the feeling of, am I enough of my culture? How do I relate to my culture when my family is telling me whether or not I'm engaging with that? Why is it that when I look around, I don't see anybody who looks like me? Why is it when I look around, like the feelings of expectations of what I'm supposed to be don't jive with how I feel? And each of the kids that are in the story have that to some degree. They're all lonely. They're all trying to find out like who they are in this kind of larger world, that they don't have a lot of room to figure out who they are. And I think reading the story, and it's really focusing on these two best friends. And I put, kind of my like anxiety and my thoughts about, being a third culture kid into the main character, and then into her best friend, I put gender thoughts. And other stuff that I certainly did not experience, but I thought was important for to talk about, like a child who is being deliberately removed from their culture. The main character's best friend is half Filipino, but their father had passed away. And so they were raised by their white family, who was very racist, and, who very much was like, you're not connecting with your family. You're a burden on us. We don't want you around. And as the main character is learning that their best friend has been navigating that, and the feelings of like, oh God, like I'm a terrible friend, but they're not. They're kind of, the main character is has been the anchor for the best friend. And I think that reading that as a child, where I had very, very intense friendships, I would use the word codependent because, well, I think that's pretty common in friendships. I also, now I'm just like, were they friendships, or were they me having feelings for my friends and not realizing that they were queer feelings? I think reading a book like that would have been really special for me. And I really hope that any kid who does not see themselves in books, we are in a great age of having a lot more inclusive, younger books for kids, grows up to create those books, because they deserve to have books in which they see themselves. I think everyone deserves to see themselves in a story. And sometimes that means you have to create that story.
Okay, I love that your books are very inclusive, because even nowadays we don't have many characters that are non-white, or if they are non-white, it's their only characteristic. So it's great that your characters are complex and they are non-white, they are queer, because it's usually like, if your character is non-white, your character can be queer, because then it's too many minorities. But we are, as you said, intersectional individuals, and we are more than one minority sometimes. So, but my question is about, you mentioned COVID. So my question is about, in your book, The Bruising of Qilwa, there is a pandemic happening in the story. And I want to know, how did the COVID-19 pandemic affected the writing of your story?
It's a good question, because a lot of people are like, oh, so you wrote this in response to COVID? And I was like, no, I actually drafted it before COVID. I guess I'm just fascinated by plagues. I think this happens because I come from a medical, like a more biomedical background. I think that's really where it comes from. But I was very cognizant of the fact that we were sending it out to publishers during COVID and before vaccines were out. And I kind of talked to my agent, and I was just like, is this going to be bad? And she's like, well, I give all of them a heads up that there's a plague in the book. But it's not about a plague. It's like the plague is the backdrop that causes the characters to do certain things. But and I use it as a marketing thing, right? I'm like, and the main character has to solve a magical plague. But really, it's about like, what does it mean to be a migrant in a city that is very hostile toward you, and when there's a more complex colonial history than just that. But I wasn't cognizant, when I was working on it, of just like, people are tired of plagues. Plague stories are not new, right? But people are tired of plague stories, and it's very understandable. I kind of wish that maybe people would still be tired of it, because a lot of people think that we are no longer in a pandemic. A lot of people, and I get it, it's hard to continue to go out into the world acting as if it's a pandemic, but people are still dying from COVID. Long COVID is going to have we don't even know kind of the consequences of long-term COVID, but they are coming. You know, there was long SARS, which is a related virus, and there is already long COVID. So yeah, I was cognizant of, you know, how am I, in some ways, the plague is a plot device. In many ways, I should say, the plague is a plot device. But one of the things that I really wanted to have in Qilwa, and that because I was noticing it during COVID, was healthcare worker exhaustion and burnout. You would constantly hear stories, you know, I would hear news stories all the time of like, there are no more hospital beds. People who have procedures that are not related to COVID can't get them because there's just not enough staff or there's not enough equipment, especially in the first, 8-9 months of the pandemic. There seemed to be a real helplessness around how tired healthcare workers were because they were the front lines, right? And healthcare worker exhaustion is not new. There's a lot of burnout with medical professionals, but I think it was particularly heightened during the pandemic for obvious reasons. So that's what I really wanted to center in a book that ended up being a plague book, was the feeling of I am helpless around these like the larger forces of the world. So where can I do good? And I think, one of the reasons that I was a pre-med when I was doing, I was doing research while being a pre-med, and then I stopped being a pre-med to just do research. But there are many people who want to be in medical professions because they're like, that's the best way to help people, right? Is it the best way to help people? I mean, that's a whole other conversation, but I've seen friends go through medical school. I've would talk to residents. My brother and sister-in-law are both doctors, and consistently exhaustion has been the thing that I have come away with when talking to them. And that doesn't mean that they don't do good work. That doesn't mean they don't care, but I think that that's a reality that so many of the people outside of the healthcare field too, but so many people on the front line are overextending themselves. Medical residents in the United States pull 100-hour plus weeks. That's ridiculous. Nobody should be doing that. And yet that's how they learn to be doctors. And that, we have a whole mess of healthcare system here. So that's also another conversation. But, who has access to healthcare? Who, what kind of health disparities that happen in different communities? These are like all related conversations. And I really wanted to reflect on that. I really wanted to be like, okay, well, if I'm going to write a book about a plague during a plague, what is the thing that I really want to center? And really, it was the kind of people who are on the front lines.
And I think that's very nice. I would have loved to read that book in the pandemic, because I use literature as my personal shelter when I was in pandemic, because I've been through a lot. Everybody actually in the pandemic was suffering a lot, but I do believe that literature has that power, And talking about the power of literature, I saw some things about the Heretics workshop, and it sounds like a unique and inclusive space. And what inspired its creation, and how do you see it challenging traditional academics programs?
Yeah, I'm so glad to talk about this. So the Heretics workshop is the brainchild of me and my best friend, December Cuquero, who's a writer, an incredibly amazing short story writer. We went through the MFA together. So we both came to Reno to study with David Anthony Durham, who is an acclaimed fantasist, and mostly he has 2 middle grade books out. He worked on one of the George R.R. Martin TV shows that I think ended up being canceled. But he's an acclaimed fantasist of color, and that's so we both came to University of Reno to work, or University of Nevada Reno to work with him, and that's where we went. We met in school, and consistently we were both really dissatisfied with what we were getting in the academic circles around creative writing. We both felt like the workshop model is beneficial to 0 people. The workshop model that is done in the United States comes from the University of Iowa, which was the first creative writing master's program that happened. And it's called the Iowa method, or the cone of silence method, where the author sits there in silence and everyone around them discusses the work. And then depending on your instructor, maybe at the end, the author can comment. But no matter what is being said, the author stays silent. And in some ways, this can be very useful because the idea being that if the author is not commenting on what the workshoppers are saying, the workshoppers can be more honest. The problem is that this was created at a time when they were bringing a lot of white men into the workshop space. It was designed for white men, probably white cishet men, to be even more specific. And it was particularly so that the United States could create a cultural art that could rival Russian ballet and Russian literature. It was very much tied to the American capitalist identity as an anti-communist move. And this was in the 30s. And that method of workshop continues today. And a lot of professors swear by it because that's how they were trained. They believe that that's how you can get the best feedback from your work. But the reality is that for marginalized writers sitting in that workshop space, people say the most asinine things. I mean, it's truly like on the kind end, it's when people talk about something over and over again that you're like, man, that was like a throwaway line. I didn't, whatever. On the unfortunate end is when you get microaggressions. In my very first MFA workshop, one of my classmates compared the world of Qilwa in a different story to Agrabah, which is the made-up Disney's Aladdin world. And it's such an incredibly racist comment to make. And he was like, you should bring in a Marco Polo character to introduce us to this world. And I was like, well, clearly you don't read fantasy, but that's very common to get stuff like that in workshops. A lot of writers of color will talk about how people are like, this doesn't read as realistic to me, or like, I don't understand. One example of like, wow, there's a lot of queer characters in this story, as if queer people don't congregate together, right? As if like, I know very, very few people who are straight. So because we find our people, right? Like that's what happens. And you get these kind of comments because people are used to having what their ideas of the world centered in workshop and in literature. And that's makes a workshop very difficult to be in and very frustrating to be in. Also, I kind of have seen this across multiple workshop spaces where people forget, if you bring in novel pages, people forget what a novel looks like. And they want to know everything in the first 10 pages. And I'm like, listen, like, have you never read a book before? So, December and I came out of that workshop, came out of the MFA program incredibly jaded. And this isn't, I have commentary on University of Nevada in particular, but this is really a problem with the MFA structure in the United States in general. We were just like, well, the things that I learned, like I learned more from talking about craft with December than I ever did in my classes. You never talk about craft in the workshop. Not really. You're supposed to be, but you don't. One time one of my instructors did a craft lesson where he pulled out a short story from Alice Munro and we went through and we looked at every single word and how the paragraphs were structured. And that was the best lesson that I had. So we came out of that and we were like, well, that was not fun. But also a lot of people, there's a lot of bad writing advice out there. You can ask me another time about why I hate show, don't tell. I think it's one of the worst pieces of advice someone can give. And we were like, but, we care about building community. We care about making these things accessible to people. So Reno it doesn't have like a huge literary scene. And so we're like, okay, well, if it doesn't exist, I guess we should make it. It happened to be that Nevada Humanities has put on what's called the literature crawl for many years in Northern Nevada, where basically they get a bunch of authors to do different panels that happens, during a day in the fall. And we knew that was coming up. I had previously done some panels with them. And so we pitched a workshop around, about like how we can reinvent tropes in a more interesting way. And then the Heretics really took off from there, where we decided to do monthly workshops where we would take kind of a craft idea or what have it, and break it down with people, talk about it, try to figure out how to make this accessible, not charging anything for anyone. And also keeping in mind that we wanted a space in which marginalized writers could come and feel like their voices and their their ambitions and their hopes and their writing would be centered. So we did that. And then, it happened to be that a new independent bookstore had recently opened up. So they had reached out to me and they were like, you want to do some author stuff? And I was like, how about we run this workshop? And they were like, yeah, that's great. And it ends up that these people are do a lot of a lot of activism now. I do with them, which is great. And we went from the monthly workshops. Now every week I go and I sit at this bookstore and I'm like, hey, come write with me. And then once a month we do some sort of workshop. It's like the last one that we just did was on using sensory details in your food and in your writing. And we used food as an example. We try to do a lot of generative stuff so that people come away with kind of like, okay, I've practiced this now. And I feel like I'm in a space where I can share what I practice and get feedback if I want to. And we don't focus on workshop, actually. Plenty of people have asked us like, hey, are you going to do a critique workshop? And we're like, the problem with critique workshops is that not everyone's going to be your best reader. So rather than that, we try to focus on like, well, how can you, start learning more about craft and your craft and what you find, what fits your aesthetic and what fits your cultural understanding of craft. That's the other thing I didn't mention at the beginning is that craft is cultural. The fact that a lot of writers of color in the U.S. workshop space feel alienated is because they're being the workshop lens is a different cultural lens than what we've come to in our stories. So that's, the Heretics now we've been almost 2.5 years, I think. And it's, it's kind of amazing to me, the reception that we've had in Reno, that people feel very, very lucky when they're really excited when they find us. And I feel very lucky that we have such a great host in the Radical Cat, which is the bookstore. So, yeah, we'll keep going, we'll see what happens. But we're excited to be here.
So congratulations on your work. I think it's amazing because usually when you think about these kind of programs and these workshops, these writing workshops, unfortunately, it's usually too strict. There are too many rules. And usually the person who is teaching is talking about too many rules, and literature is not that. Literature is about breaking the rules, and art in general is about being subversive and breaking the rules. And you mentioned show, don't tell, and it's like it works for some writers, it doesn't work for others, and it shouldn't be a rule because literature shouldn't have a rule. But my question is about the political climate in the US. So given what is happening in the US currently, what do you think is the importance of literature written by queer authors and authors of color and immigrant authors? And we've been there in this situation until very recently, so we can relate.
Yeah, it's fun. We in the US have a tendency to center ourselves as like the center of the world. And the reality is that, there's a reason why a lot of people use like writers of the global majority instead of writers of color, right? Because it tends to be a more accurate term. Yeah, we're not the only people to face who has been facing fascism right now, historically, and also kind of right now in the present moment. It's tricky with literature, and particularly queer literature, because Project 2025, which is this giant document that was put together by the Heritage Foundation, which is like this right-wing think tank. What is a think tank? It's like a made-up thing. A group of conservatives who are like, here's our vision of America. And it's not new. There's been a version of this document for many decades, but in this latest version, within the first 5 pages, it very clearly lays out what will happen to teachers, librarians, authors, publishers who publish queer literature for children, which is prosecution and for potentially being put on a sex offender register list. And this is part of the wave of book challenges that has been happening in the United States for the last few years, particularly in the past 2-ish years. The numbers have skyrocketed. In the 2023 to 2024 year, that academic year, there was over 10,000 book challenges around the nation. And of course, book challenges are deliberate. And I'm using book challenges instead of book bans because book bans are like deeply unpopular in the US consciousness. But so the way that they're done now is this isn't a ban, we want it on a different shelf. This isn't a ban, we just want it to be appropriately labeled. this isn't a ban. We just don't think that everyone should have access. Like, okay, yeah, a ban, a ban loosely, like, removing something that was once available. So book challenges is kind of a broader term. That's terrifying. It's scary that a lot of these books that are challenged are not ones that have been published recently, but the ones that have been published recently are very deliberately written by authors of color who tend to be talking about racial experiences in the United States, and queer authors who tend to be talking about queer experiences in the United States. And it's deliberate, right? This is not a secret. They all use the same playbook. A lot of the same books are being challenged. It's not the first time that queer material has been labeled as pornographic. And now, what was once really focused on, gay men in particular, now has kind of shifted over to trans people, particularly trans women. And it's, the same it's the same talking points, it's the same fear. And so I think for a lot of us right now, we're really afraid. What does it mean to publish as a queer author, as a queer kidlit author who's writing queer kidlit in this environment? And I don't have a good answer for that, because we need queer books. We need books written by people of the global majority. We need books that show what different immigrant experiences look like. We need books centering disabled people and the ways in which the world is not accessible, because we all live that, right, in some form. And even if you're incredibly privileged, I bet there was a time in your life that you felt othered, even if you're incredibly privileged, that's all the more reason to read about experiences you don't have, right? Because you don't know what you don't know. I am heartened by groups like Authors Against Book Bans. I'm really, really honored to be a part of them. I'm the Nevada chapter leader with Gemma Hartley, who actually writes adult books, but is also very passionate about it, has kids of her own. And what we're hoping is that publishers who have the money and legal resources to, stand up to some of the legislation that's going on, we're hoping that enough of us will come together that will pressure publishers to do something, because they have the power to do something. But it's hard to kind of get people mobilized. It's hard because people are scared, because if people don't know what to do, and because the moment you speak out, you're speaking out about something. And the reality is most people don't want to, because it's scary. And I get it. It's scary. What we do creatively is going to be different than what is published. The reality is publishing has long been kind of, U.S. publishing operates under the same kind of white supremacist, capitalist, ableist systems that perpetuate the rest of the stuff in the United States and elsewhere. So that's always the case, right? The people who publish in, we who publish in the system, we have been deemed as like sanitized enough, our work sanitized enough, or we found the right advocates to be able to push for us. If you're in the bigger publishing houses, there's a lot of small publishing houses who are not in under the control of these larger groups, and therefore can publish more subversive stuff. And of course, there are plenty of subversive stuff that flies under the radar. So there is a different question between, what are we going to be creating right now versus what are we going to be publishing? The reality is publishing in the United States works on several years ahead timeline. By the time you sell it takes about roughly 2 years by the time you sell the book to when it heads up on the shelf. So the books that are going to be coming out in the next 4 years, half of the, for the next 2 years, books are probably being scheduled right now into 2027. It'll be interesting to see if we have a democracy in 2027, which is a slightly different issue. So I don't, and it's been particularly hard because there's been a lot of publishing upsets. HarperCollins went through a unionization. Was it 2 years ago now? If they're still upset from that, Hachette just bought out, some conservative imprint, but also bought out Barnes and Noble's publishing arm. I mean, publishing is there's constantly stuff going on. There's not, too much work, not enough pay. People are trying to live in New York City on shoestring budgets, sort of thing. So it's already a very slow system. So I don't know what publishing is going to look like, because it really depends on whether or not there is really going to be legislation that that penalizes authors, librarians, teachers, principals, etc., for getting kids the books that they need. But I think a lot of art is going to be created that, you know, if we're lucky enough to have an after, that will be quite subversive and pushing back on stuff. And I really hope that the smaller presses are able to keep pushing the bounds and keep publishing the stuff that the bigger ones don't necessarily want to hear. But it, you know, a lot of it comes down to money. So my hope is, I mean, literature, any art is going to art, and art, like, I don't want to say art flourishes in hard times, because you don't need hard times to make good art. But it's particularly important that we make good art in hard times, because artists, we have our finger on the cultural pulse, and culture doesn't shift unless art is shifting. And I really, really hope that that we'll see some, you know, that we'll be safe. Those of us who are in the kidlit sphere, writing queer stuff. I really hope so.
We hope that too. And I'm curious about your creative process, because when I'm writing, it's the thing that I have the most difficulty with. So I also know that you are a gamer, that you play games. Yes, I'm a video game aficionado. I love playing video games. So I want to know, what role do your hobbies like gaming play in inspiring or refreshing your creative process?
I'm absolutely a gamer, and they're integral to me. You know, I wrote the Bruising of Qilwa because I played Dragon Age 2, and I was fascinated by the plight of the Ferelden's in Kirkwall and Anders in his clinic. I mean, Dragon Age 2 directly inspired the Bruising of Qilwa, in every conceivable way. And a lot of times what happens is that I'm like, oh, what if this meets that? This is like a relatively new thing in my creative process, and maybe the last couple of years, where I'm, you know, I play something and I'm like, huh, what if this and this other thing that I'm either playing or I'm watching or whatever, how would those two things come together? So, for example, there is it technically a deck building game? It's like a deck building roguelike called Slay the Spire. It's a lot of fun. You're going up this spire, and you're like fighting these monsters with a deck of cards, and you're trying to slay the spire. But at the end, you're like, did I actually slay the spire? And then the whole cycle repeats. And there actually is a lore in this game. It's just you have to piece together a lot of stuff. So I've put a lot of money, like 100 hours into this game. And then I was doing another playthrough, because it's very, it's like a game I can turn my brain off to. Around the same time, I was watching Delicious in Dungeon, which is what it's called on Netflix in the US. It's called Dungeon Meshi in Japan, and it's like a D&D, Dungeons and Dragons-esque setting, where there's these different races, these different classes, and they go into the dungeon, and it's just like, okay, how do you make it through this dungeon, sort of thing. And I started wondering, like, oh, what would it look like if I had, this closed loop system, this closed dungeon that you can't escape, and you keep being reborn every time you die, and you keep trying to get to the top, with the Delicious in Dungeon mind of like, there's some like, they're like larger stuff, but a lot of it is about cooking. A lot of it is about like, we're going to eat the monsters in the dungeon. And so that's an idea that, like, I don't know what'll come of this idea. I have like a like in my notes, I've kind of just jotted down some potential stuff, but that's a lot of how my ideas have lately been generated is, here's the thing I'm enjoying, and let me mash it with another thing that I'm enjoying. And what does that look like? So yeah, video games are essential. I'm playing the Tears of the Kingdom right now, the sequel to Breath of the Wild, and it's very peaceful. It's so there's just no urgency in this game, and it's great. And for me, a lot of it is about like, I'm hyper fixated on this character or the story or what have you. And now I have to think of a way that I can write this. And I definitely think this comes out of my background in fan fiction, for sure.
Well, I think I must keep on this topic since we are so excited talking about it. And I'm really interested as well of asking you about, we who are interviewing you and many of the people who are also watching are from the linguistics and literature course, which here in Brazil for us is just one undergraduation course, literature and linguistics. And maybe when we first start in college, we have this impression that the writer is an old man with a beard and isolated who plays classical music and types on the typewriting machine, isolated from society. And well, you are just showing us that's not like this. So I would like to ask you, what else influences your writing? I'm talking about movie, cinematography, songs, if you also get inspired by lyrics that you really like. And also, of course, if you can recommend us something that is on your top list of movies that you always go back to, cozy place, or maybe a place that will instigate us to think about, and what is around the universe of this writer who is you.
If we didn't just talk about video games, I would have been like, I'm very inspired by video games. I used to be a lot. I remember a lot of lyric stuff. It used to that used to really spark a lot of stuff. Right now, I'm very much in my video game era, but it has been smashed with stuff that I'm watching show wise or movie. Like I don't know what this story will look like. This is literally just like a single line idea, but I watched the cosmic horror movie Event Horizon, which came out 2001, 2011. It has Lawrence Fishburne in it. And the cosmic horror that's a whole other separate thing. That is my new horror thing that I'm really in. And I have not read any Lovecraft, and I'm not interested in reading Lovecraft, but I'm very interested in reading all of the people who are challenging Lovecraft. But cosmic horror, I think cosmic horror is so cool. And I'm hoping that we have a book out to editors right now that's a cosmic horror that I'm hoping will sell. So, right now that one just like Event Horizon meets a time loop. So a lot of times I'm watching something, whether it's a movie that, my spouse is really well watched. He watches a lot of movies. I never took like a film studies course, and I wish I had, because he'll be like, look at the way this shot is made. And I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about, but it's fascinating. So for me, a lot more times it's about kind of what the character development is, or what the plot is, or something maybe that was said that sparks something the idea wise. But also shows. I think right now I just rewatched season 1 of Arcane with my husband, so we're about to do season 2. We haven't seen it yet. No spoilers, please. We're very excited. But I have an Arcane idea, in the back of the thing, and I think a lot of it is about whenever I'm watching, engaging, or whatever with something, that I go, how would I approach this? And I think that's a great way to start from anything, because the idea that we have to produce original stuff, like throw that idea out. That's just going to stress you out. Instead, think about how would you tell that story? And that makes it original, because it's how you're going to tell that story, right? And in some ways, like, do people want original stuff? There's comfort in expectations. That's why tropes are loved, because there's comfort in knowing what's happening, and there's a reason we like them. So what makes it fresh, what makes it interesting, is your personal spin on it. And when I find that when people are coming from a marginalized background, you necessarily have something interesting to say about whatever it is that you're going to do. So I definitely recommend that. If there's something that you hyperfixate on, or you're like, this is a cool idea, think about like, how would I approach it? And if nothing else, it's an interesting writing exercise. So yeah, I'm very excited to watch season 2 of Arcane. Let me think, what else? As I mentioned, Dungeon Meshi. Yeah, video games. Video games are a big one. Another thing I've been doing also is rewatching movies that I either didn't see in my childhood but came out at that time, or I did, and thinking about like, what is this doing? What is the cultural messaging in this? What is the storytelling in this? So like growing up, Labyrinth was my comfort movie. Recently, with David Bowie and Jennifer Connelly. Recently rewatched that movie, and it was very interesting to see the kind of weird, there's a particular scene that I've always hated. And there's a lot of racial coding in that scene when I rewatched it. And I was like, oh. And my husband's like, well, no wonder you hated it. And I was like, yeah, I guess I knew, but it's also like very, very queer, despite the, the theoretically heterosexual romance with a 16-year-old. So sorry. Yeah, so my husband and I have been watching a lot of classic horror movies, which are a lot easier for me to watch, not always between my fingers, because it's the technology has changed enough that I can be like, oh, you don't look so scary. That's interesting to see and be like, what is this? What is the kind of messaging around this? We've been watching some like teen movies that came out when we were teens that my parents would never have let me watch. So we watched, like She's the Man a few months ago, which is with Freddie Prinze Jr. And I don't remember who the female lead is. I don't know if she's in anything else, but it's like a retelling of, I think, of one of Shakespeare's stuff. But like it's a classic like nerdy girl becomes hot all of a sudden and gets with the guy. But I was thinking about like, what does a queer story of this look like? Like what are the interesting things about this? Like, oh, their chemistry is interesting because the guy can stop trying to pretend to be so macho or like whatever. So I really like watching things that I haven't engaged with in a long time, or that I didn't see that was from a particular time, particularly one that I was alive in and maybe not as conscious, to see like, what is the messaging, but also what are the things that are interesting about this that I could potentially then take and to turn into something new. So this is, you just mentioned recommendations. So I do want to mention this. A24 put out a movie called I Saw the TV Glow. Is that what it's called? I think that's what it's called. It's on Max. If I don't know if Max is available worldwide, but it's a queer horror where the queerness is an integral part of the horror. Genuinely horrifying, and it's a stunning piece of media. I mean, the last time I felt that moved by piece of media was Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is also an A24 production and absolutely stunning. So yeah, I think especially if someone marginalized is behind it, it's probably going to be some good stuff there.
Guys, if you allow me, sorry, Anna, just to give to the audience the title of the movie in Portuguese as well, so they can search for it. So the name in Portuguese is Eu Vi o Brilho da TV, okay? And in English is I Saw the TV Glow, if you guys want to search.
It's so good. It's so good.
It's on my watch list. I've heard about it. I love horror. So it's on my watch list and I want to watch it. But you mentioned cosmic horror. Cosmic horror is my favorite kind of horror. And if you haven't read it, I recommend Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. Have you read it?
I've seen the movie. It's been recommended to me many times, and the movie was great. So I know the book is very different, but
yeah, it's very different, and it's a trilogy. Now it has a fourth book, but I think you're going to like it. It's like one of the best takes of cosmic horror that I've ever seen, and I mean, it's really great. It makes us question things like what is language for, and it's very like mind blowing the way the author approaches this idea of being in almost like an alien place, but on Earth, and this idea that nature is indifferent to you. It's not that this kind of nature is evil. It's just that it doesn't care about you. So it's interesting, and I recommend it. But my question is about literature. Are there any authors that influenced your work?
Absolutely. I would be remiss to not mention N.K. Jemisin off the bat, because reading the 5th season changed my life. And I don't mean that hyperbolically. I read it in that year that I had just left my PhD program. I should also mention that I left my PhD program right as Trump got elected. That was the impetus for me leaving. I was like, okay, I can't do this anymore. The first time he got elected. And I had been recommended the 5th season by one of my closest friends, someone who's practically a brother to me. And I read it and I was like, this is what you can do with speculative fiction. I was so stunned. I'd been reading a lot of literary fiction before then, because in academic circles, speculative fiction is considered lowbrow or whatever nonsense. And wow, the 5th season changed my life. I mean, it completely changed the way I approach writing. The 5th season is the reason why Qilwa eventually happened, because I wrote I had a story that I had been working on for a while. I figured out how I wanted to tell it because I read the 5th season, and that is set in the larger world of Qilwa. And I wrote Qilwa to practice writing in that world. So I would be remiss to not mention N.K. Jemisin, who is one of the most brilliant minds we have in speculative fiction right now. but there are so many. I'm gonna have to try to think. I'm like, oh, I should have had. I should be prepared for this question, and I'm never prepared for this question. I love Charlie Jane Anders. She is one of my favorite people in the world, and she's also a brilliant, thoughtful, incredible writer. She has this craft book that came out a couple of years ago called Never Say You Can't Survive. And she wrote it during COVID. She was writing these columns for what was then Tor.com, now Reactor, where she talked about using creativity to fuel your, how do you write stories when things are bad? And so it's particularly relevant again now. It was relevant then too. And it's an excellent craft book as well. She's fantastic. And she's so smart and so thoughtful. Let me think. So I mentioned Terry J. Benton Walker, who was the editor for The White Guy Dies First. He has two books in a YA contemporary fantasy, Blood Debts and Blood Justice, that are it's like a Game of Thrones for Black people, with Black people for teens, that has an adult. It was originally adult. It might shift to adult. There's a lot kind of going on there, but it's brilliant. It's a brilliant look at kind of contemporary American issues with Blackness and queerness being centered. So he's phenomenal. And he has a middle grade series as well, which is something very similar, and it's called Alex Wise versus the End of the World. The first one, Alex Wise versus the Cosmic Shift, is the second one, which is, like a young Black boy learning what it means to come into his own as a superhero. And that comes by embracing himself, but also embracing failure and knowing that kind of things are like the world sometimes sucks. So those are certainly great. I'm trying to think. I can't believe I just have forgotten every book I've ever read. This year, The Saint of Bright Doors came out this year? Was it this year or last year? It's been on the awards circuit. It's won a slew of awards, and they're well worth it. I mean, talk about a book that I need to reread it, because that's another book that if that's one of those books that you read and you're like, oh, my writing will be changed from this. It's just a really brilliant way to subvert tropes that are, but they're not tropes, and it's very compassionate. It's about a chosen one who has rejected being a chosen one, and it opens up in a therapy group of rejected chosen ones. That's the opening scene. It's so good. That's great. Emily Tesch's Some Desperate Glory won the Hugo Award, and that's a book that I was not expecting to love as much as I did, because you think you know what the book is going to be about. And then the book is about that, but it is also very much not about that. If you've seen She-Ra and the Princess of Power, which is the reboot of She-Ra on Netflix, which I also love. I love She-Ra so much. I thought it was going to go kind of in that sort of round, this is Adora learning that the Horde is evil. And it was that to some extent, but it also was not that at all. And it was such a delight to read that book, and it's a standalone, which I love, because I can't read long books anymore. Shannon Chakraborty is an incredible writer. She wrote the Daevabad trilogy, but I particularly recommend The Adventures of Amin al-Sarafi, which is the beginning of her new trilogy, a historical fantasy, because it's so fun. It follows this middle-aged mom who was a really famous pirate and is coming out of retirement. Shannon does an incredible amount of research for her stuff. I was reading the book, she asked me to read it for gender stuff, for queer stuff, genderqueer stuff specifically. And I was taking notes on okay, I gotta learn about my own people's histories. She is so on it. She's so great. Let me think. Who else do I absolutely love right now? I love a lot of people. I should have been prepared for this question. But that was a lot of recommendations, so I guess I'll pause there.
And I hope that this comes full circle and you will be mentioned as an inspired and innovating author, which you already are, I'm pretty sure. So we are approaching our end, and I wanted to ask you about your future plans. So what are you most excited about your upcoming work, The Glade, or as known as Sleepaway, aka Sleepaway?
I'm very excited for it. I'm about to turn on book promo mode, and so that's kind of strange. It's going to be very different doing a middle grade than an adult. The people I'm going to be talking to are not going to be there will be the readers, but I'm writing it for kids, and the only way I'm going to be talking to kids is in school visits. But the kids are the ones who are buying it. Their parents are, their teachers are, librarians are. So it's going to be interesting, but I am very excited to see what people think, because nobody has read this story except for my team. And so, like I will send it to Terry to blurb, and I'm nervous about what he's going to think. He's going to be, he tells me like, I would read you writing a grocery list. And I'm like, that's very generous of you. Thank you. This is because we're best friends. Right now we have 4 projects out to editors. So I'm actually really looking forward to taking a break because I'm very tired. I'm very burnt out. And, the nature of the publishing industry, it's a whole other conversation, but my hope is that something of them will be picked up, whether it's the novel set in the same universe as Bruising of Qilwa, set 40 years later, whether it's the cosmic horror that I mentioned, which is a cosmic horror comedy, dark academia. It's a novella. I hope it gets picked. It's irreverent, but it was a lot of fun to write. And it completely bashes my undergrad because it's set on that campus, and that has it's a big colonial history there. Mostly right now, I am excited to teach. So I teach through a nonprofit called Roots, Wounds, Words, but I've been thinking about creating some videos, putting them up, and seeing if people are interested in kind of like a separate kind of long-term writing intensive thing, because of my, I talk a lot about like, I would love to run my own MFA program so I could do the thing. And one of my students, because I'm teaching right now, is like, well, you could just do something like that just by yourself, like not in a or with an organization or in an academic context. And I was like, so I'd like to plan some stuff on there. And of course, I'm going to be doing a lot of work for our public libraries right now. I'm a founding member of Freedom to Read Nevada. And we were working very hard to keep our libraries funded because it was on the ballot this year and it didn't pass. So our libraries are about to lose a quarter of their budget. So really what I want to focus on in particular the next 6 months is making sure that our libraries stay funded because we need public libraries. So, yeah. And reading a lot. I'd like to read again. It's funny how much you stop reading sometimes, even as an author. I listen to a lot of audiobooks, but I would like to sit down and actually be able to read again. So it'll be nice.
Anna, would you?
Okay, so we are almost ending our interview, but my question is, what's your advice to young authors or people who want to become authors? Because here I think we all write a bit or want to be writers someday in the future. So what's your advice?
Keep writing the next thing. This is a kind of a common advice even to people who are already publishing. It can be tough, that I've right now I've had to pause on writing the next thing because I wrote the next thing like 3 times last year. But the reality is that your first, your fourth, your 8th project might not get picked up, but the next one might. And it doesn't mean that those projects won't. And sometimes it's like I'm writing into the void, but truly no word is ever wasted because a character can come back, an idea can come back, and you practice. If nothing else, you practice. And writing, like any art, comes down to practice. The other thing is study craft. And I mean this in a deliberate way, which is not just read broadly, read widely in your genre and outside of your genre. Because if you want to write it in a genre that you don't read in, how do you even know you have anything to say? So you have to read in the genre, but you also should read outside of it. But works that you admire, take it after you finish reading the thing and ask yourself, what is the thing that I admire? How did the author achieve that? And go through the text, find textual examples of how the author achieved that thing. That is how you level up your craft. And it's a tough thing. You have to really practice at it. You kind of have to treat it as an academic assignment, but I'm telling you, it changes how you approach writing. And that is how you consistently grow as a writer. Picking up things that you admire, even sometimes things that you don't admire. And you're like, why don't I like this? And seeing why you don't like it. But if you think of it like a literature assignment, examine how the author uses voice. That's a very broad thing. You might be like, well, this author is using multiple points of view. So how are these points of view coming across differently? This is my go-to example because Sofia Samatar's The Winged History is a masterclass in how to write point of view. 3 first-person perspectives and the 4th perspective is a 3rd person, and each of them are distinct, and that is incredibly difficult. So if you go through and say, oh, This character has certain kinds of sentence structures. They're long and rambly. How funny that she happens to be a romantic and daydreams a lot. This person uses a lot of metaphor and simile. How interesting that she's a songstress. This person is really concerned about the past and is constantly flipping between past and present, even in tenses. How interesting that they're concerned with their father's legacy. This is how you learn how to be deliberate in your work. And I really think that even if you're just like, I'm not feeling motivated to write, I don't know what to write or whatever, start with craft.
Well, wow. I just want to end this and go writing something. Or even take the courage to show the things I have on my drawer. It's there. Well, maybe not. Well, I would like to finish this amazing talk we had, first of all, by thanking you, but we still have one thing to ask you, but already thanking everybody that's watching until here. And I would like you to tell us where we can find you online, website, social medias, and just an info for the Brazilian public about your books. I've, for example, listened to the audiobook of the Bruising of Qilwa. So for the Brazilian public, it's the audiobook is available on Amazon Audible. It's part of the signing, whatever. And also we can buy the ebook. So even though if we would buy a physical version, it would take a while. The ebook is instantly on our hands. So please, could you tell us where we can find you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so delighted that you listened to the audiobook because that's my favorite way. The audio is absolutely incredible. Phaedra Alcasi was just, he was so good. So my website is naseemwrites.com, although in theory, naseemjamnia.com should redirect there. I am going to be doing a revamp of it because I have to now switch to different promo mode. But there you can sign up for my newsletter. They're called the Tuesday Telegrams. They happen right now for the month of December. I'm taking off, but they happen twice a month on Tuesdays, every other week. And one of them is a personal essay, and one of them is about writing, publishing, etc. And you can opt into one or both. You don't have to do. Not everyone wants to hear about my personal rambles. So that will start up again in January. My social media, I'm just on Instagram right now. It's at JamsterNazi. Technically, I also have a TikTok under that name, but I have been locked out of that TikTok. And so I don't know how to get to it. And I don't really use it, but I'm definitely on Instagram sometimes. Definitely my newsletter is the best way to stay in touch with me because as you said, I'm very diligent about it. I really force myself to sit down and write it every 2 weeks. Let's see. Yeah. So the Bruising of Qilwa is available now. It's on paperback, audio, ebook. The ebook, if you get it directly from Tachyon, which is the publisher, that gives them and me the most money for what it's worth. But also please just, if you can get it from your library, I would love if we could sell Portuguese translation rights. We did sell Spain translation rights, which is not the same at all. And I respect that it's not the same, but my hope is that when that comes out, maybe we'll sell other translation rights. We'll see. And The Glade comes out at the end of May 27th, I believe is the date. That comes out from Simon & Schuster, and I believe they have world rights. So in theory, maybe there will also be other translations. I sure hope so. That'll be interesting. So that's what's up for me. Thank you all so much for coming and thank you for your wonderful questions. I had such a great time chat. Like I promised you I could talk for 4 hours. I could still keep going. So thank you for your wonderful questions. Thank you for having me. Thank you all for watching. This has been an absolute delight.
No, we were all delighted.
Thank you for your answers. It was amazing. And maybe one of us will translate your book. I hope so.
I would love that. I would love that.
Yeah. Well, I think, guys, okay, we wrap it up? Yeah. So thank you, everybody. Please, guys, check the other Literary Talks videos here on YouTube. There are also other writers, translators, and interesting interviews as well. Thank you so much. Our interviewee, my colleagues, Kael and Anna, thank you. And that's it. Bye-bye, guys.
That's it. Bye-bye.